A Scandal in Bohemia. Sherlock Holmes always referred to Irene Adler as the woman. I rarely heard him use any other name for her. In his mind, she overshadowed all other women. It wasn't that he felt romantic love for Irene Adler. All emotions, particularly love, were repulsive to his cold, precise, yet remarkably balanced mind. He was, I believe, the most exceptional reasoning and observing machine the world had ever seen. But as a lover, he would have placed himself in an awkward situation. He never discussed the gentler aspects of life except with mockery and cynicism. He saw them as valuable tools for understanding people's motivations and actions, useful for an observer. But, for a trained reasoner like him, allowing such intrusions into his own delicate and finely tuned temperament was like adding a distracting element that could cast doubt on all his intellectual conclusions. A grain of sand in a sensitive instrument, or a crack in one of his high-powered lenses, would not be more disruptive than a strong emotion in a nature like his. And yet, there was only one woman for him, and that woman was the late Irene Adler, a figure of dubious and questionable reputation. I had not seen much of Holmes lately. My marriage had caused a distance between us. My own complete happiness and the domestic responsibilities that arise for a man who becomes the master of his own home were enough to consume all my attention. Meanwhile, Holmes, who detested any form of social interaction with his Bohemian soul, stayed in our lodgings in Baker Street, buried in his old books. He alternated between weeks of cocaine use and ambition, the drowsiness of the drug and the intense energy of his own sharp nature. He was still, as always, deeply fascinated by the study of crime, and he devoted his immense abilities and exceptional powers of observation to pursuing clues and solving mysteries that had been abandoned as hopeless by the official police. Occasionally, I would hear vague reports about his activities, his summons to Odessa in the case of the Trepoff murder, his solution to the strange tragedy of the Atkinson brothers at Trincomalee, and finally, the mission he accomplished so discreetly and successfully for the reigning family of Holland. Aside from these signs of his activity, which I merely shared with all the readers of the daily press, I knew little about my former friend and companion. One night, it was March 20th, 1888, I was returning home from a visit to a patient, for I had now resumed my medical practice, when my route took me through Baker Street. As I passed the familiar door, which will always be associated in my mind with my courtship and the dark events of the Study in Scarlet, I was seized with a strong desire to see Holmes again and to learn how he was employing his extraordinary abilities. His rooms were brightly lit, and even as I looked up, I saw his tall, slender figure pass twice in a dark silhouette against the blind. He was pacing the room quickly, eagerly, with his head bowed and his hands clasped behind him. For me, who knew his every mood and habit, his posture and demeanor told their own story. He was back at work. He had emerged from his drug-induced dreams and was hot on the trail of some new problem. I rang the bell and was shown up to the room that had once been partly my own. He was not overly effusive. He seldom was, but I think he was pleased to see me. With barely a word, but with a kind look, he motioned me toward an armchair, tossed across his case of cigars, and indicated a liquor cabinet and a gasogene in the corner. Then he stood before the fire and scrutinized me in his peculiar introspective way. "Marriage suits you," he remarked. "I believe, Watson, that you have gained 7.5 pounds since I last saw you." "7," I answered. "Indeed, I would have guessed a bit more. Just a touch more, I suspect, Watson. And back in practice, I see. You didn't tell me you intended to return to work." "Then how do you know?" "I see it. I deduce it. How do I know you have been getting yourself very wet lately, and that you have a very clumsy and careless maid?" "My dear Holmes," I said, "this is too much. You would surely have been burned had you lived a few centuries ago. It's true that I had a country walk on Thursday and came home in a terrible mess, but since I have changed my clothes, I can't imagine how you deduced it. As for Mary Jane, she's incorrigible, and my wife has given her notice. But again, I fail to see how you figured it out." He chuckled to himself and rubbed his long, nervous hands together. "It's simplicity itself," he said. "My eyes tell me that on the inside of your left shoe, right where the firelight strikes it, the leather is marked with 6 almost parallel cuts. Obviously, they have been caused by someone who very carelessly scraped around the edges of the sole to remove caked mud from it. Therefore, you see, my double deduction is that you were out in atrocious weather, and that you have a particularly malicious boot-slitting specimen of a London maid. As for your practice, if a gentleman walks into my room smelling of iodoform, with a black mark of silver nitrate on his right forefinger, and a bulge on the right side of his top hat to show where he has hidden his stethoscope, I must be truly dull if I don't declare him to be an active member of the medical profession." I couldn't help laughing at the ease with which he explained his process of deduction. "When I hear you give your reasons," I remarked, "the thing always appears to me to be so ridiculously simple that I could easily do it myself, though, at each successive instance of your reasoning, I am baffled until you explain your process. And yet, I believe that my eyes are as good as yours." "Quite so," he answered, lighting a cigarette and throwing himself down into an armchair. "You see, but you do not observe. The distinction is clear. For example, you have frequently seen the steps leading up from the hall to this room." "Frequently." "How often?" "Well, some hundreds of times." "Then how many are there?" "How many? I don't know." "Quite so. You have not observed, and yet you have seen. That is precisely my point. Now, I know that there are 17 steps, because I have both seen and observed. By the way, since you are interested in these little problems, and since you are kind enough to chronicle 1 or 2 of my trivial experiences, you may be interested in this." He tossed over a sheet of thick, pink-tinted notepaper that had been lying open on the table. "It arrived by the last post," he said. "Read it aloud." The note was undated and lacked both a signature and an address. "There will call upon you tonight at 7:45, it said, "a gentleman who desires to consult you upon a matter of the very deepest moment. Your recent services to one of the royal houses of Europe have shown that you are one who may safely be trusted with matters which are of an importance which can hardly be exaggerated. This account of you we have from all quarters received. Be in your chamber then at that hour, and do not take it amiss if your visitor wear a mask." "This is indeed a mystery," I remarked. "What do you imagine it means?" "I have no data yet. It is a grave mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to fit theories, instead of theories to fit facts. But the note itself, what do you deduce from it?" I carefully examined the writing and the paper on which it was written. "The man who wrote it was presumably well off," I remarked, attempting to imitate my companion's methods. "Such paper could not be purchased for less than half a crown a packet. It is exceptionally strong and stiff." "Exceptional. That's the very word," said Holmes. "It's not an English paper at all. Hold it up to the light." I did so and saw a large E with a small g, a P, and a large G with a small T woven into the texture of the paper. "What do you make of that?" asked Holmes. The name of the maker, no doubt. Or his monogram, rather. Not at all. The G with the small t stands for Gesellschaft, which is the German for company. It is a customary abbreviation like our Co. P, of course, stands for Papier. Now for the EG. Let us glance at our Continental Gazetteer. He retrieved a heavy brown volume from his shelves. Eglonitz. Here we are, Egria. It is in a German-speaking country, in Bohemia, not far from Carlsbad. Remarkable as being the scene of the death of Wallenstein, and for its numerous glass factories and paper mills? Ha 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 ha, my boy. What do you make of that? His eyes sparkled, and he sent up a large blue cloud of triumph from his cigarette. The paper was made in Bohemia, I said. Precisely. And the man who wrote the note is a German. Do you notice the peculiar construction of the sentence? This account of you we have from all quarters received. A Frenchman or Russian could not have written that. It is the German who is so discourteous to his verbs. It only remains, therefore, to discover what is wanted by this German who writes on Bohemian paper and prefers wearing a mask to showing his face. And here he comes, if I am not mistaken, to resolve all our doubts. As he spoke, there was the sharp sound of horses' hooves and grinding wheels against the curb, followed by a sharp pull at the bell. Holmes whistled. "A pair, by the sound," he said. "Yes," he continued, glancing out of the window. "A nice little brougham, and a pair of beauties, 150 guineas apiece. There's money in this case, Watson, if there is nothing else. I think I should go, Holmes." "Not at all, Doctor. Stay where you are. I am lost without my Boswell, and this promises to be interesting. It would be a pity to miss it." "But your client—" "Never mind him. I may need your help, and so may he. Here he comes. Sit down in that armchair, Doctor, and give us your best attention." A slow and heavy step, which had been heard on the stairs and in the passage, paused immediately outside the door. Then there was a loud and authoritative knock. "Come in," said Holmes. A man entered who could hardly have been less than 6 feet 6 inches tall, with the chest and limbs of a Hercules. His attire was rich, with a richness that in England would be considered bordering on bad taste. Heavy bands of astrakhan fur were slashed across the sleeves and fronts of his double-breasted coat, while the deep blue cloak that was thrown over his shoulders was lined with flame-colored silk and fastened at the neck with a brooch consisting of a single flaming beryl. Boots that extended halfway up his calves and were trimmed at the tops with rich brown fur completed the impression of barbaric opulence suggested by his entire appearance. He carried a broad-brimmed hat in his hand, while he wore across the upper part of his face, extending down past the cheekbones, a black visored mask, which he had apparently adjusted just that moment, for his hand was still raised to it as he entered. From the lower part of his face, he seemed to be a man of strong character, with a thick, hanging lip, and a long, straight chin, suggestive of determination, pushed to the point of stubbornness. "You received my note?" he asked, in a deep, harsh voice with a strongly marked German accent. "I told you I would call." He looked from one to the other of us, as if uncertain whom to address. "Pray, take a seat," said Holmes. "This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, who occasionally is kind enough to assist me in my cases. Whom have I the honor of addressing?" "You may address me as the Count von Kram, a Bohemian nobleman. I understand that this gentleman, your friend, is a man of honor and discretion, whom I may trust with a matter of the utmost importance. If not, I would much prefer to communicate with you alone." I rose to leave, but Holmes seized my wrist and pushed me back into my chair. "It's both, or none," he said. "You may say before this gentleman anything that you may say to me." The Count shrugged his broad shoulders. "Then I must begin," he said, "by binding you both to absolute secrecy for 2 years. At the end of that time, the matter will be of no significance. At present, it is no exaggeration to say that it is of such weight that it may have an influence on European history." "I promise," said Holmes, "and "You will excuse this mask," continued our strange visitor. "The esteemed person who employs me wishes his agent to be unknown to you, and I may confess at once that the title by which I have just called myself is not precisely my own." "I was aware of it," said Holmes dryly. "The circumstances are extremely delicate, and every precaution must be taken to suppress what could become an immense scandal and seriously compromise one of the reigning families of Europe. To speak plainly, the matter implicates the great house of Ormstein, hereditary kings of Bohemia." "I was also aware of that," murmured Holmes, settling himself down in his armchair and closing his eyes. Our visitor glanced with some apparent surprise at the languid, lounging figure of the man who had no doubt been described to him as the most insightful reasoner and most energetic agent in Europe. Holmes slowly reopened his eyes and looked impatiently at his gigantic client. "If your Majesty would deign to state your case," he remarked, "I would be better able to advise you." The man sprang from his chair and paced up and down the room in uncontrollable agitation. Then, with a gesture of desperation, he tore the mask from his face and flung it on the ground. "You are right," he cried. "I am the king. Why should I attempt to conceal it?" "Why, indeed?" murmured Holmes. "Your Majesty had not spoken before I was aware that I was addressing Wilhelm Gottsreich Sigismund von Ormstein, Grand Duke of Kassel-Felstein, and hereditary King of Bohemia." "But you can understand," said our strange visitor, sitting down once more and passing his hand over his high white forehead. "You can understand that I am not accustomed to conducting such business in my own person. Yet the matter was so delicate that I could not confide it to an agent without putting myself in his power. I have come incognito from Prague for the purpose of consulting you." "Then pray consult," said Holmes, shutting his eyes once more. "The facts are briefly these. Some 5 years ago, during an extended visit to Warsaw, I made the acquaintance of the well-known adventuress, Irene Adler. The name is no doubt familiar to you." "Kindly look her up in my index, Doctor," murmured Holmes without opening his eyes. For many years, he had adopted a system of cataloging all paragraphs concerning people and things, so that it was difficult to name a subject or a person on which he could not immediately provide information. In this case, I found her biography sandwiched between that of a Hebrew rabbi and that of a staff commander who had written a monograph on deep-sea fishes. "Let me see," said Holmes. Born in New Jersey in the year 1858. Contralto. La Scala. Prima donna Imperial Opera of Warsaw. Yes, retired from operatic stage. Ha! Living in London. Quite so. Your Majesty, as I understand, became entangled with this young person, wrote her some compromising letters, and is now desirous of getting those letters back." "Precisely so. But how? Was there a secret marriage?" "None." "No legal papers or certificates?" "None." "Then I fail to understand, Your Majesty. If this young person should produce her letters for blackmailing or other purposes, how is she to prove their authenticity?" "There is the writing." "Pooh! Forgery!" "My private notepaper." "Stolen." "My own seal." "Imitated." "My photograph." "Bought." "We were both in the photograph." "Oh, dear," That is very bad. Your Majesty has indeed committed an indiscretion. I was mad. Insane. You have compromised yourself seriously. I was only Crown Prince then. I was young. I am but 30 now. It must be recovered. We have tried and failed. Your Majesty must pay. It must be bought. She will not sell. Stolen, then. 5 attempts have been made. Twice burglars in my pay ransacked her house. Once we diverted her luggage when she traveled. Twice she has been waylaid. There has been no result. No sign of it? Absolutely none. Holmes laughed. It is quite a pretty little problem, he said. But a very serious one to me, returned the king reproachfully. Very, indeed. And what does she propose to do with the photograph? To ruin me. But how? I am about to be married. So I have heard. To Clotilde Lothman von Saxe-Meiningen, second daughter of the King of Scandinavia. You may know the strict principles of her family. She is herself the very soul of delicacy. A shadow of a doubt as to my conduct would bring the matter to an end. And Irene Adler? Threatens to send them the photograph, and she will do it. I know that she will do it. You do not know her, but she has a soul of steel. She has the face of the most beautiful of women, and the mind of the most resolute of men. Rather than I should marry another woman, there are no lengths to which she would not go. None. You are sure that she has not sent it yet? I am sure. And why? Because she has said that she would send it on the day when the betrothal was publicly proclaimed. That will be next Monday. Oh, then we have 3 days yet, said Holmes with a yawn. That is very fortunate, as I have 1 or 2 matters of importance to look into just at present. Your Majesty will, of course, stay in London for the present? Certainly. You will find me at the Langham, under the name of the Count von Kram. Then I shall drop you a line to let you know how we progress. Pray do so. I shall be all anxiety. Then, as to money? You have carte blanche. Absolutely. I tell you that I would give one of the provinces of my kingdom to have that photograph. And for present expenses? The king took a heavy chamois leather bag from under his cloak and laid it on the table. There are 300 pounds in gold and 700 in notes, he said. Holmes scribbled a receipt on a sheet of his notebook and handed it to him. And Mademoiselle's address? He asked. Is Bryony Lodge, Serpentine Avenue, St. John's Wood. Holmes took a note of it. One other question, he said. Was the photograph a cabinet? It was. Then, good night, Your Majesty, and I trust that we shall soon have some good news for you. And good night, Watson, he added, as the wheels of the royal brougham rolled down the street. If you will be good enough to call tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock, I should like to chat this little matter over with you. At precisely 3 o'clock, I arrived at Baker Street, but Holmes was still absent. The landlady informed me he had departed shortly after 8 that morning. I settled near the fireplace, intending to wait for him no matter how long it took. I was deeply engrossed in his current investigation. While lacking the grim and eerie elements of the previous cases I had witnessed, the nature of the case and the high standing of his client lent it a unique character. Beyond the subject matter, it was a joy to observe Holmes's masterful grasp of situations and his sharp, insightful reasoning. His success was so consistent that the possibility of him failing never crossed my mind. It was nearly 4 o'clock when the door opened, revealing a disheveled and intoxicated-looking groom with a red face and shabby attire. Accustomed to Holmes's remarkable disguise abilities, I needed to look thrice before recognizing him. With a nod, he vanished into his bedroom, reappearing 5 minutes later in his usual tweed suit, respectable and composed. He stretched out his legs towards the fireplace, chuckling heartily for several minutes. "Well, really?" he exclaimed, choking back another fit of laughter that forced him to slump back into his chair, helpless. "What's so amusing?" I inquired. "It's utterly hilarious. I doubt you could ever guess how I spent my morning or what I ultimately did," he replied with a mischievous glint in his eyes. "I can't imagine. I presume you've been observing the habits, perhaps even the house, of Miss Irene Adler." "Exactly. But the outcome was rather unusual. Allow me to explain. I left the house just after 8 this morning, disguised as an unemployed groom. There's a remarkable camaraderie amongst those involved in horses. Be one of them, and you'll learn everything there is to know." I quickly found Bryony Lodge. It's a charming villa with a rear garden, but built right up to the road at the front with 2 stories. The door is fitted with a Chubb lock. A spacious sitting room on the right side, well furnished, with large windows reaching almost to the floor, and those absurd English window fasteners that a child could open. Nothing remarkable behind, except that the passage window was accessible from the top of the coach house. I walked around it, examining it closely from all angles, but observed nothing else of interest. I then strolled down the street and, as expected, found a mews in a lane running alongside one wall of the garden. I assisted the ostlers in rubbing down their horses, earning 2pence, a glass of half and half, 2 fills of shag tobacco, and as much information about Miss Adler as I could desire, not to mention gossip about half a dozen other people in the neighborhood who held no interest for me, but whose life stories I was forced to listen to. "And what about Irene Adler?" I asked. "Oh, she's turned all the men's heads in that area. She's the most charming creature under a bonnet on this planet, according to the men in Serpentine Mews. She leads a quiet life, sings at concerts, drives out at 5 every day, and returns at precisely 7 for dinner. She seldom ventures out at other times, except when she sings. She has only one male visitor, but he's a frequent one. He is dark, handsome, and dashing, never calling less than once a day, often twice. He is a Mr. Godfrey Norton of the Inner Temple. You see the advantage of a cabman as a confidant. They've driven him home from Serpentine Mews a dozen times and know all about him." After listening to their tales, I began to pace up and down near Bryony Lodge once more, contemplating my plan of action. This Godfrey Norton clearly plays a significant role in this matter. He is a lawyer, which sounds ominous. What's the nature of their relationship, and what is the purpose of his repeated visits? Is she his client, his friend, or his mistress? If the former, she has likely entrusted the photograph to his care. If the latter, it's less probable. The answer to this question determines whether I should continue my work at Bryony Lodge or shift my focus to the gentleman's chambers in the temple. It's a delicate matter, and it expands the scope of my inquiry. I fear I'm burdening you with these details, but I need you to understand my challenges if you're to grasp the situation. "I'm following you closely," I affirmed. As I was still pondering the matter, a handsome cab pulled up at Bryony Lodge, and a gentleman jumped out. He was remarkably handsome, dark, with an aquiline nose and a mustache. Undoubtedly the man I had heard about. He seemed to be in a hurry, shouting to the cabman to wait, and brushed past the maid who opened the door with the confidence of someone who felt at home. He spent about half an hour inside, and I could catch glimpses of him in the sitting room windows, pacing back and forth, talking excitedly and waving his arms. I couldn't see her. Soon he emerged, looking even more flustered than before. As he approached the cab, he pulled out a gold watch and consulted it intently. "Drive like the devil," he shouted. "First to Gross and Hankey's in Regent Street, and then to the Church of St. Monica in the Edgware Road. Half a guinea if you do it in 20 minutes." They sped off, and I wondered if I should follow them when a neat little landau came up the lane. The coachman's coat was only half-buttoned, his tie askew, and the harness straps were hanging loose. It hadn't even come to a complete stop before she burst out of the hall door and into it. I only glimpsed her briefly, but she was a beautiful woman, with a face a man could die for. "The Church of St. Monica, John," she cried, "and half a sovereign if you reach it in 20 minutes." This was too good to miss, Watson. I hesitated between running after them or hiding behind her landau when a cab appeared in the street. The driver looked twice at such a shabby fare, but I hopped in before he could object. "The Church of St. Monica," I said, "and half a sovereign if you reach it in 20 minutes. It was 25 minutes to 12, and it was obvious what was happening. My cabbie drove quickly. I don't think I've ever traveled faster, but the others were there ahead of us. The cab and the landau, with their steaming horses, were in front of the door when I arrived. I paid the man and rushed into the church. There was no one there except the two I had followed, and a clergyman in his robes, who seemed to be arguing with them. All three stood clustered in front of the altar. I strolled up the side aisle like any other idle visitor who had dropped into a church. Suddenly, to my surprise, the three at the altar turned towards me, and Godfrey Norton ran as fast as he could towards me. "Thank God," he cried. "You'll do. Come, come." "What then?" I asked. "Come, man, come. Only 3 minutes, or it won't be legal." I was half-dragged to the altar, and before I knew it, I was mumbling responses whispered in my ear, vouching for things I knew nothing about, and generally assisting in the secure union of Irene Adler, spinster, to Godfrey Norton, bachelor. It all happened in a flash, and there was the gentleman thanking me on one side and the lady on the other, while the clergyman beamed at me in front. It was the most ridiculous situation I've ever found myself in, and it was the memory of it that made me laugh earlier. It seems there was some irregularity with their license, the clergyman absolutely refusing to marry them without a witness of some sort. And my fortunate appearance saved the groom from having to scour the streets for a best man. The bride gave me a sovereign, and I intend to wear it on my watch chain as a memento of this occasion. "This is a rather unexpected turn of events," I commented. "And what happened next?" "Well, my plans were seriously threatened. It seemed the pair might depart immediately, forcing me to take swift and decisive action. At the church door, however, they separated, he driving back to the temple, and she to her own house. "I shall drive out in the park at 5 as usual," she said as she left him. I heard no more. They drove off in different directions, and I went to make my own arrangements. "Which are?" "Some cold beef and a glass of beer," he replied, ringing the bell. "I've been too busy to think of food, and I'm likely to be even busier this evening. By the way, Doctor, I'll need your cooperation." "I'll be delighted." "You don't mind breaking the law?" "Not in the least." "Nor risking arrest?" "Not for a good cause." "Oh, the cause is excellent." "Then I'm your man. I was certain I could rely on you." "But what is it you want?" "When Mrs. Turner brings in the tray, I'll explain. Now," he said, turning hungrily to the simple meal our landlady had provided, "I must discuss it while I eat, as I haven't much time. It's nearly 5 now. In 2 hours we must be at the scene of action. Miss Irene, or rather Madame, returns from her drive at 7. We must be at Bryony Lodge to meet her. And then? Leave that to me. I've already planned what will happen. There's only one point I must insist on. You must not interfere, no matter what. Do you understand? I'm to remain neutral? To do absolutely nothing. There will likely be some minor unpleasantness. Don't get involved. It will end with me being taken into the house. 4 or 5 minutes later, the sitting room window will open. You're to position yourself near that open window. Yes. You're to watch me, as I'll be visible to you. Yes. And when I raise my hand, like this, you'll throw into the room whatever I give you to throw. And at the same time, shout, "Fire!" Do you understand? Completely. It's nothing too serious, he said, pulling a long cigar-shaped object from his pocket. It's a standard plumber's smoke rocket, fitted with a cap at each end to make it self-lighting. Your task is limited to that. When you shout "fire," quite a few people will take it up. You can then walk to the end of the street, and I'll rejoin you in 10 minutes. Have I made myself clear? I'm to remain neutral, get near the window, watch you, and at the signal, throw in this object, then shout "fire," and wait for you at the corner of the street. Precisely. Then you can count on me entirely. Excellent. I think it's almost time I prepare for the new role I have to play. He disappeared into his bedroom and returned a few minutes later, transformed into a kind and simple-minded, nonconformist clergyman. His broad black hat, baggy trousers, white tie, sympathetic smile, and general air of peering, benevolent curiosity were a match for only Mr. John Hare. It wasn't just Holmes's clothes that changed. His expression, his manner, his very soul seemed to shift with every new character he assumed. The stage lost a brilliant actor, and science a keen reasoner, when he dedicated himself to the art of crime. It was 6:15 when we left Baker Street, and 10 minutes to the hour when we found ourselves in Serpentine Avenue. Dusk had fallen, and the street lamps were just being lit as we paced back and forth in front of Bryony Lodge, awaiting the arrival of its occupant. The house was, as I had imagined it, based on Sherlock Holmes's concise description, but the area seemed less private than I had expected. For a small street in a quiet neighborhood, it was surprisingly bustling. There was a group of poorly dressed men smoking and laughing in a corner, a scissors grinder with his wheel, 2 guardsmen flirting with a nurse girl, and several well-dressed young men strolling up and down, cigars in their mouths. "You see," remarked Holmes as we walked back and forth in front of the house, "this marriage simplifies matters somewhat. The photograph now becomes a double-edged weapon. It's likely she would be just as averse to it being seen by Mr. Godfrey Norton as our client is to it reaching the eyes of his princess. Now the question is, where do we find the photograph?" "Where, indeed?" "It's highly unlikely she carries it on her person. It's cabinet size, too large to conceal easily in a woman's dress. She knows the king is capable of having her intercepted and searched. 2 such attempts have already been made. So we can assume she doesn't carry it with her." "Then where?" "Her banker or her lawyer. Those are the 2 possibilities, but I'm inclined to think neither. Women are naturally secretive, and they like to keep their secrets close. Why would she hand it over to anyone else? She could trust her own guardianship, but she couldn't be certain what indirect or political influence might be brought to bear on a businessman. Besides, remember that she had decided to use it within a few days. It must be where she can easily access it. It must be in her own house." "But it's been burgled twice." "Nonsense! They didn't know how to look." "But how will you look?" "I won't look. Then what? I'll get her to show me. But she'll refuse. She won't be able to. But I hear the rumble of wheels. It's her carriage. Now follow my instructions to the letter." As he spoke, the gleam of the sidelights of a carriage appeared around the bend of the avenue. It was a stylish little landau that rattled up to the door of Bryony Lodge. As it pulled up, one of the loitering men in the corner dashed forward to open the door, hoping to earn a copper, but was elbowed aside by another loafer who had rushed up with the same intention. A fierce argument erupted, fueled by the two guardsmen who took sides with one of the loungers, and the scissors grinder, who was equally passionate on the other side. A blow was struck, and in an instant, the lady, who had stepped out of her carriage, was at the center of a small knot of flushed and struggling men, striking savagely at each other with their fists and sticks. Holmes charged into the crowd to protect the lady, but as he reached her, he cried out and fell to the ground, blood flowing freely down his face. At his fall, the guardsmen fled in one direction and the loungers in the other, while a number of better-dressed people, who had watched the scuffle without participating, crowded in to assist the lady and tend to the injured man. Irene Adler, as I shall continue to call her, hurried up the steps, but stood at the top, her magnificent figure outlined against the hall lights, looking back into the street. "Is the poor gentleman badly hurt?" she asked. "He's dead," cried several voices. "No, no, there's life in him," shouted another. "But he'll be gone before you can get him to the hospital." "He's a brave fellow," said a woman. "They would have taken the lady's purse and watch if it hadn't been for him. They were a gang, and a rough one, too. Ah, he's breathing now. He can't lie in the street. May we bring him in, ma'am?" "Certainly. Bring him into the sitting room. There's a comfortable sofa. This way, please." Slowly and solemnly, he was carried into Bryony Lodge and laid out in the main room, while I continued to observe from my post by the window. The lamps had been lit, but the blinds were not drawn, so I could see Holmes as he lay on the couch. I don't know if he was seized with remorse at that moment for the part he was playing, but I can say I have never felt more ashamed of myself than when I saw the beautiful creature against whom I was conspiring, or the grace and kindness with which she attended to the injured man. Yet, it would be the most treacherous betrayal of Holmes to back down now from the role he had entrusted to me. I hardened my heart and took the smoke rocket from under my ulster. After all, I thought, we're not harming her. We're only preventing her from harming another. Holmes sat up on the couch, and I saw him gesture as if in need of air. A maid rushed across and threw open the window. At the same instant, I saw him raise his hand, and at the signal, I tossed my rocket into the room with a shout of "Fire!" No sooner had the word left my lips than the entire crowd of spectators, well-dressed and poorly dressed, gentlemen, ostlers, and maids, joined in a general scream of "Fire!" Thick clouds of smoke billowed through the room and out the open window. I caught a glimpse of rushing figures, and a moment later, Holmes's voice from within assuring them it was a false alarm. Slipping through the shouting crowd, I made my way to the corner of the street, and in 10 minutes was delighted to find my friend's arm in mine and to escape the scene of commotion. He walked swiftly and in silence for a few minutes until we had turned down one of the quiet streets leading towards the Edgware Road. "You did it very well, Doctor," he remarked. "Nothing could have been better. It's all right. You have the photograph?" "I know where it is." "And how did you find out?" "She showed me, as I told you she would." "I'm still in the dark." "I don't want to make a mystery out of it," he said, laughing. "The matter was quite simple. You, of course, realized that everyone in the street was an accomplice. They were all hired for the evening. I guessed as much. Then, when the commotion erupted, I had a bit of moist red paint in the palm of my hand. I rushed forward, fell down, pressed my hand to my face, and became a pitiful sight. It's an old trick. That, too, I could comprehend. Then they carried me in. She was bound to have me in. What else could she do? And into her sitting room, which was the very room I suspected. It lay between that and her bedroom, and I was determined to see which. They placed me on a couch. I gestured for air. They were forced to open the window. And you had your chance. How did that help you? It was crucial. When a woman believes her house is on fire, her instinct is to rush to whatever she values most. It's an overwhelming impulse, and I've taken advantage of it more than once. It was useful to me in the Darlington substitution scandal, and also in the Arnsworth Castle case. A married woman grabs her baby. An unmarried one reaches for her jewel box. Now, it was clear to me that Our Lady of today had nothing in the house more precious to her than what we are seeking. She would rush to secure it. The alarm of fire was admirably done. The smoke and shouting were enough to shake nerves of steel. She responded beautifully. The photograph is in a recess behind a sliding panel, just above the right bell pull. She was there in an instant, and I glimpsed it as she partially pulled it out. When I cried out that it was a false alarm, she put it back, glanced at the rocket, rushed from the room, and I haven't seen her since. I rose, excused myself, and left the house. I hesitated about attempting to secure the photograph immediately, but the coachman had come in, and as he was watching me closely, it seemed safer to wait. A bit too much haste could ruin everything. "And now?" I asked. "Our quest is practically over. I shall call with the king tomorrow, and with you, if you'd like to join us. We'll be shown into the sitting room to wait for the lady, but it's likely that when she arrives, she'll find neither us nor the photograph. It might be satisfying for His Majesty to retrieve it with his own hands." "And when will you call?" "At 8 in the morning. She won't be up, so we'll have a clear field. Besides, we must be prompt, as this marriage may mean a complete change in her life and habits. I must wire the king immediately." We had reached Baker Street and stopped at the door. He was searching his pockets for the key when someone passing by said, "Good night, Mr. Sherlock Holmes." Several people were on the pavement at the time, but the greeting seemed to come from a slender youth in an ulster who had hurried past. "I've heard that voice before," said Holmes, gazing down the dimly lit street. "Now, I wonder who the devil that could have been." The next morning, while Sherlock Holmes and I were enjoying our breakfast, the King of Bohemia burst into our lodgings at Baker Street. "You have it," he exclaimed, seizing Holmes by the shoulders, his eyes filled with eagerness. "Not yet," Holmes replied calmly. "But you are hopeful?" "I have hopes." "Then come. I am impatient to leave." "We shall need a cab." "My carriage awaits." "Excellent. That simplifies things." We descended and set off for Briony Lodge once more. "Irene Adler is married," Holmes stated nonchalantly. "Married? When?" the king asked, bewildered. "Yesterday." "To whom?" "An English lawyer named Norton." "But she couldn't possibly love him." "I hope she does," Holmes said with a subtle smile. "Why hope?" the king questioned. "Because it would eliminate any future concerns for your majesty. If she loves her husband, she won't love your majesty. And if she doesn't love your majesty, there's no reason for her to interfere with your plans." The king nodded thoughtfully. "It's true, and yet I wish she were of my own standing. What a queen she would have made!" He fell silent, lost in contemplation, until we arrived at Serpentine Avenue. An elderly woman stood at the open door of Bryony Lodge, her gaze sharp and sardonic as we stepped out of the carriage. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume?" she inquired. "That's me," my companion replied, his expression inquisitive and slightly startled. "Indeed. My mistress informed me of your visit. She left this morning with her husband, catching the 5:15 train from Charing Cross to the continent." "What?" Holmes stumbled back, his face pale with surprise and frustration. "You mean she's left England?" "Never to return," the woman confirmed. "And the papers?" the king asked, his voice hoarse with despair. "All is lost." "We shall see," Holmes said with a determined glint in his eye. He pushed past the servant and rushed into the drawing room, followed by the king and myself. The furniture was scattered haphazardly, drawers open and shelves emptied, as if the lady had hastily ransacked the room before her departure. Holmes swiftly tore back a small sliding shutter, plunged his hand inside, and pulled out a photograph and a letter. The photograph depicted Irene Adler in an evening gown, while the letter was addressed to Sherlock Holmes, Esquires to be left till called for. My friend tore it open, and we read it together. Dated the previous night at midnight, the letter read, "My dear Mr. Sherlock Holmes, you really did it very well. You took me in completely. Until after the alarm of fire, I had not a suspicion. But then, when I found how I had betrayed myself, I began to think. I had been warned against you months ago. I had been told that if the king employed an agent, it would certainly be you. And your address had been given me. Yet, with all this, you made me reveal what you wanted to know. Even after I became suspicious, I found it hard to think evil of such a dear, kind old clergyman. But, you know, I have been trained as an actress myself. Male costume is nothing new to me. I often take advantage of the freedom which it gives. I sent John, the coachman, to watch you, ran upstairs, got into my walking clothes, as I call them, and came down just as you departed. Well, I followed you to your door, and so made sure that I was really an object of interest to the celebrated Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Then I, rather imprudently, wished you good night, and started for the temple to see my husband. We both thought the best resource was flight, when pursued by so formidable an antagonist. So you will find the nest empty when you call tomorrow. As to the photograph, your client may rest in peace. I love and am loved by a better man than he. The king may do what he will without hindrance from one whom he has cruelly wronged. I keep it only to safeguard myself and to preserve a weapon which will always secure me from any steps which he might take in the future. I leave a photograph which he might care to possess, and I remain, dear Mr. Sherlock Holmes, very truly yours, Irene Norton, née Adler." "What a woman! Oh, what a woman!" the king exclaimed after we finished reading. "Did I not tell you how quick and resolute she was? Would she not have made an admirable queen? Is it not a pity that she was not on my level?" "From what I have seen of the lady, she seems, indeed, to be on a very different level to your majesty," Holmes replied coldly. "I am sorry that I have not been able to bring your majesty's business to a more successful conclusion." "On the contrary, my dear sir," the king cried, "nothing could be more successful. I know that her word is inviolate. The photograph is now as safe as if it were in the fire." "I am glad to hear your majesty say so. I am immensely indebted to you." Pray tell me in what way I can reward you. This ring." He slipped an emerald snake ring from his finger and held it out. "Your Majesty has something which I should value even more highly," Holmes said. "Name it." "This photograph." The king stared at him in astonishment. "Irene's photograph," he cried. "Certainly, if you wish it." "I thank your Majesty. Then there is no more to be done in the matter. I have the honor to wish you a very good morning." He bowed, ignoring the king's outstretched hand, and departed with me for his chambers. And so a great scandal threatened the kingdom of Bohemia, thwarted by the cunning of a woman. Holmes, who used to revel in the cleverness of women, had lately fallen silent on the subject. And when he spoke of Irene Adler, or her photograph, it was always with the utmost respect, referring to her as the woman. The end. If you liked the story, hit that like button and subscribe for more videos. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Was there anything that surprised you? Who's your favorite character in the story? I can't wait to hear your thoughts.